All right, welcome to our series of interviews with people I think you should meet. Today we're going to meet Jason Florio. Jason is a friend. He's someone I've worked with. He's a photographer and a filmmaker, and he has a sort of unusual focus. He likes to focus on sort of underreported stories, the ones that, in English that means the ones that don't make you a lot of money. But he has done some pretty interesting things, and he's always kept a sense of humor and a sense of purpose. And I think with that, let's just get into it and let's introduce Jason. How you doing, Jason?
Hey Robert, this is so cool. I'm so stoked you're doing a podcast, finally.
Well, I'm the only person left on the planet that doesn't have a podcast, and soon I'll be selling crypto and motivational tapes and supplements, so hang in there.
And you will make them, make the investors rich, no doubt. So I'm from Kingston, which is West London, but I moved to the States in my early 20s, where I started working as a photo assistant in Dallas, Texas. That took me on to New York. Good old days when I was slightly fitter and less grey. I was quite involved in the skateboarding scene, and England being a dark, dreary place, we decided that obviously watching too many Tony Alva videos and stuff, we needed to actually go to the motherland of skateboarding. So we went to the States. And that took us through Texas, and through one way or another ended up coming back and moving to Texas, where I had the opportunity to start working with a really great photographer called Peter Robbins, who was a fashion photographer, but his real passion was more in photojournalism, and it was he was the one that opened me up to the idea of kind of more documentary photography. But I was very much involved in the kind of fashion portrait world in the early stages when I was an assistant. No, skateboarding, I definitely didn't make any money. I wasn't a pro or anything like that. It was definitely more of a lifestyle choice than anything else. But skateboarding definitely influenced the way I looked at the world, because I think skateboarders tend to look at the world in kind of a different way compared to a lot of people. It was again, it was punk rock, DIY, and I think all those things definitely helped. As as a photographer, you got to be kind of DIY. You got to think on your feet. You got to look at the world in a very sort of different way, I think. So I was I think I was 23, somewhere around there, and I had a friend of mine in Dallas that I met, and he was actually working as a photo assistant, and I was always interested in photography, but never actually thought about it as a career, more of just a kind of a hobby, really. And he said, look, I've got this guy I'm working for, I'm moving on to another photographer, do you want to take my spot? So I went to see the photographer. He was this super cool guy, Peter Robbins, and I said, look, I really don't know anything at all, but he sort of handed me a Hasselblad back, and he said, okay, load film in that. I had no idea what I was doing. I could barely put a circular reflector back together. But he and his studio manager was super encouraging, and within a few days they said, here's the keys to the studio. When you're not working on the set with us, then you need to be in the studio, you need to be practicing, you need to be working, and there was a good scene, a good sort of group of young photo assistants. So people, if I needed help on a shoot, you kind of Shanghai one of your friends, and you do the same for them. I think pretty quickly I was like, okay, no, this is far more than just something to pay the rent. I fell in love with it really quickly. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it, because, like I said, the people I was around, it was definitely more sort of commercial, fashion portraiture. But through Peter, like I said, he would sort of take his summer holidays and sort of disappear off to Egypt and come back with with these beautiful black and white pictures, which had absolutely nothing to do with Neiman Marcus and J.C. Penney's and girls in frocks kind of thing. But from there, I decided to move to New York, and I had a great breakthrough. A friend of mine, Brazilian assistant called Paulo, and he worked for Annie Leibovitz. But he was also kind of, because he was working in that very sort of high level of photographers. He introduced me to a British Indian photographer called Max Vadukul, and Max was an interesting guy. He was doing very high-end fashion stuff. So we were traveling all over the world. We'd fly down to Mar-a-Lago to photograph Trump for the New Yorker one day, or we'll be doing the Rolling Stones, or doing Victoria's Secret. It was...
What was his day rate?
It was like, 25, 30 grand, I should think, a day. I mean, that was the heyday of making serious money. I was 31 at that point. So I'd already started shooting in Dallas. I was, shooting some commercial work for, for some of the, a little bit for some ad agencies and doing the fashion stuff. But I realized if I need to push it, I need to get out of Dallas and, try New York. Obviously, New York is the epicenter of photography in the US. My early days in New York were working with Max, and that was the good thing about that was I was paid very well. We had a great lifestyle, traveled all over the world, met, everyone, like I said, from Mother Teresa to hanging out with Trump for a weekend. I'll tell you my Trump story later about flying back with him. And so I was like, for editorial stuff, it was like about $500 a day, and then advertising, Max would normally give me, I'd get like another bonus of like 1,000. So it was, for back then, it was as far as you got a load of responsibility, but you kind of don't have the final responsibility as such. So, and it was a bit of a...
You could have stayed doing that, right?
Yeah, it was a bit of a golden handcuffs, really. But they got to a point in '96, and Max and he had a fantastic assignment from the New Yorker to go to India, and it was the first time I'd really sort of gone somewhere that was in the developing or third world. And it just completely blew my mind. I mean, came back from India after a few weeks, completely sort of shell-shocked, but, go, okay, this is where I need to be at. And during that trip, I met an English woman who's a writer, and we decided that we would meet up in Bangkok. I would take a sabbatical for 3 months from Max. She would write kind of travel and news stories, and I would do the photography. But I ended up actually having a really great break through my friend Paolo, who'd worked for Annie. He had a friend that was a very, very well-renowned Brazilian journalist called Pepe Escobar. And Pepe was a foreign correspondent, and he was living in Bangkok, a complete gonzo journalist. He was just an intriguing character, super smart, talking globalization before I'd even heard the word. I spent 3 months with Pepe, and we traveled around Southeast Asia, so Burma, Cambodia, and Thailand were our kind of main beat. So I was selling pictures to his newspaper, which was the O Estado de São Paulo, and that was '97. So we sort of stayed in contact, and then in '99 he called me and he said, "Oh, we should do something on the Jihad Trail." And I'm like, what the hell is the Jihad Trail? No, you couldn't really Google back then. But anyway, in 2000 we decided to meet in India, and from there we would go up to Kashmir and look at these jihad networks.
You could put on the number of one hand how many people were covering the post-Afghanistan Mujahideen, right? Sort of what we now know as Al-Qaeda were called the Afghans, right? The Arab Afghans. And these people all went back to their homes, and they began to proselytize and sort of say, why are we ruling under this guy? Let's do this, let's do that. And that was the beginnings of terrorism.
But this is where, you were right there at that time as well, though, huh? You were fully immersed. So it's amazing we didn't cross paths back then, really.
And you remember, bin Laden was actually kicked out of Saudi Arabia and ended up in Khartoum. And at that time, he wasn't as flamboyant, as he was later, but he was basically creating businesses as a cover to keep these 200 jihadis employed, right? And he did also agriculture and things like that. And in '96, he got kicked out and he went to Jalalabad, mostly because of Rasul Saif, who was not the Taliban, by the way. There was no connection between Saif, but Saif was very friendly from the old days when bin Laden used to fight out of Jaji. And I was up the street from bin Laden in '96, and I didn't think it was that big of a deal because the locals just thought he was a punk. You know, he was on the run with his big woolly-headed bodyguards and stuff like that. Now, had you tried to sell that as a story back then, people would be like, I don't get it. What do you mean there's Afghans living, there's Arabs living in Afghanistan, and they're on the run, and the CIA's trying to kill him, but they can't find him, but they won't kill him because of the Saudi arm deal. I mean, it was a very complicated world back then. But it wasn't as deadly. You know, the idea that being next to Al-Qaeda or whatever would end up in your kidnapping or execution, they were proselytizing back then. They were selling their goods. So what attracted you to this story?
I think I needed something to latch onto, because I realized that as much as I enjoyed, being in New York and, living this, it was slightly sort of jet setter in a way. We were flying from one assignment to another, and budgets weren't really of any consequence. But I think there was times when I was stood on the set for, with Victoria's Secret and all the supermodels, and I'd been to India, I'd been to Southeast Asia with Pepe, and I was like, this, it felt nice. It was great to see all of that. And it was, I think there was that little voice inside of me was saying, you've got to move on from this. And it'd been very good to me for sure. It paid for me to take a few months off here and there to be able to go and, it's like working with Pepe for the OS Dado was, there was no money in it really. It was, you get $25 for a picture kind of thing. So you couldn't really live on it, but I'd put some money aside so I could build up a bit of a portfolio, try and figure out what the hell I was doing. I was really, in a lot of ways, rummaging around in the dark. So
How old are you at this point?
I was 31 then in 2000. Yeah, no, so I was 30 in 2000. So yeah.
All right, let's pause. So first of all, for all the young men that are watching this, so the choice was hang out with Victoria's Secret models, with the cocaine buffet and the champagne and the parties, or go to some filthy little hovel in Afghanistan to hang out with bearded jihadis. So let me weigh those up there. So is this a decision you're faced with?
Like I said, I think it was something deep down. There was someone's nudging me, going, "Come on, you've got to there's something else out there in the world." And I think it's the great thing about photography, it's an incredible vehicle to learn about yourself if you want it to. And by that point I was really obsessed with the work of say Eugene Smith and obviously Don McCullen and Jim Nachtwey, and all these people are out there doing this stuff, and I was like, I need a piece of that. That's something that I was really, really drawn to. But of course in 98 I got a copy of 97, before I went to Southeast Asia, I got a copy of your book, which was my little Bible to go to Southeast Asia with. Yeah.
Oh, you're going to blame me now. I see. So you could have been hanging out at Mar-a-Lago with Melania, but no, you had to go visit the Taliban. We got. I want you to tell me this story, because you met some interesting people and you took some great photographs. And at that time, Afghanistan was not a thing, right? And Massoud was not a person that was famous. He was famous to the French and the Europeans. The Taliban were just some weird, tiny little story in The Economist. They weren't really, in the headlines. But lay out your plan and what you did and what you.
What happened was I'll try and keep it brief, but basically I flew to Delhi, where I was supposed to meet Pepe, and I get to the Broadway Hotel, which is a sort of funky hotel in New Delhi, and there was a note there for me coming from Pepe saying, "I've gone to Pakistan, meet me in Pakistan." And I was like, oh shit, okay, now I've got to get to Pakistan, and the only way to get there at that time, you couldn't fly in, so either it was a very sort of, I'd have to make loads of connections to try and get out of India and get into Pakistan. But I heard there was a thing called the Freedom Bus, and it was basically a bus that took Muslims from different parts of India, and they would take them into Pakistan for pilgrimages and things. And so I got on this bus with all these Muslim folks that were going to, they wanted to go to particular shrines and things in Pakistan. Yeah, it was all out of our own pocket at that point. So we just little guest houses. Pepe had hooked up with a Pakistani journalist called Hawa Mehdi, and Hawa was his sort of local fixer and local journalist in his own right. He got very famous for being disappeared by Musharraf, and Christian Amanpour was part of getting him released. So yeah, there was a big thing about when Howard disappeared. When I got there, we hadn't even. There wasn't really a decision to go to Afghanistan. It was I only got there and Pepe was saying, well, look, I think the real story is in Afghanistan. It's not necessarily up in in Kashmir. Let's go to Afghanistan. So we went to the Taliban had a kind of like a little office / embassy there, if you want to call it. And we kind of pleaded our case, and it took about, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks of
get to Kabul. But yeah, it was rudimentary.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. We got a proper visa, and but you got to the border, and they literally just had a chain across it, and the guy drops the chain. We walked over. We had our backpacks on, and we find a guy with a
soldiers that were whipping the kids, and the kids were carrying like scrap metal across and like chickens, and they would hit them and make them scatter. Anyway.
Yeah, it was just sort of it was so, then you sort of cross over into this sort of medieval world, except everyone's driving Toyota Corollas and Toyota Hiluxes, and so we found this young kid with a white Corolla. Well, they're all white Corollas then, and he, we kind of arranged a price to get us to Kabul.
Beautiful, man. All right, so we're back. You're in a white, I don't know if it was left-hand drive or right-hand drive, but probably left-hand or right-hand from Japan or something, and you're heading to Kabul. So tell me your first impressions of Kabul.
Well, I just tell you briefly about what happened on the way. This was our sort of first experience of the Taliban. So we were tootling along in the Corolla, and there was a pickup truck, Hilux, going fairly slowly. So our guy goes around it. We just sort of go off, and before we know it, this Hilux has overtaken us at sort of high speed and just broadsides in front of us, and we're like, oh, F, what's going on? So anyway, it was a group of Talibs in there that didn't like being overtaken, and they get out, and our driver, who's probably less than 20 years old, they pull him out and start roughing him up, and it was like, okay, do we get out the car and intervene, or what do we do here? So Howard, I think he sort of got out and tried to, calm things down a little bit. But the kid was really shaken up, and anyway, it was just our first experience of the kind of the a-hole mentality of some of these Talibs. But then
remember the slack-jawed, when you actually saw your first Talib, how they looked like a cow had kicked them in their youth. They just had this slack-jawed, like nothing was there look.
Yeah. Well, the first, I think it wasn't too far out from, crossing the border. There were some guys sort of sat by the road in a little sort of a canopied area. And I thought, that'll make a great picture. So we get out, and again, now these very young Talibs, and they actually agreed to let me take their picture. They obviously hadn't got the memo from the head office that all pictures of anything living were haram and illegal. So anyway, I got kind of a nice portrait of those guys, and then we sort of had this interaction with the ugly side of the Talibs. And
a similar experience. I had a guy who was just a sweetheart driving his beat-up old taxi. We got pulled over by a Hilux full of I guess they get 6 inside and 6 in the back, so there's 12 of them, and they all get into it. They start yelling at the guy, and I shoved my video camera, which was a small sort of pocketbook size. I shoved that behind the seat, and he was terrified that I was taking pictures all the time, right? Because he kept saying, no picture, no picture. Yeah. You'd come to checkpoints where they would literally take the guts out of the cassettes, and they had TVs stacked up like dead things. The taxi drivers used to take their cassettes and hide them like under the dash so that the Talibs wouldn't find them.
It was like sort of black confetti, I remember. It was just ribbons of all this videotape and, cassette tapes, everything. It was some sort of, I don't know.
Islam, in the stricter, like the Deobandi view of Islam, you can't draw pictures of living things. That's why, their temples or mosques are full of like beautiful ornate scripts, but there's no physical representation of humans. And they would cut, when they found a picture, they would cut the faces out of the donkeys and the deer. And if you had a bar of soap with like this nice Pakistani model, there's some guy with a Sharpie had blacked out all the faces of every person on every package of every product you could buy, which I thought was impressive.
Yeah, I wish once we actually, the car blew up, not blew up, but the kid was sort of racing then to get us to Kabul before the curfew, before it got dark. And unfortunately whacked a rock, hit the oil sump, and we basically lost all the oil out of the car. So we got our bags out, and we felt very bad about leaving him, but hopefully someone was going to come and pick him up, as we were supposed to be in Kabul before the curfew. Ended up kind of clambering on a bus with a load of locals, and we got to the Intercon. I think it was probably 8 or 9 o'clock at night. It was well past the curfew, which.
So if I remember correctly, there was the Intercontinental. It was an old Western-style hotel. It's filthy, dirty, but because of the rocketing, there was only one floor that actually worked, and that was the floor that the Westerners were supposed to stay on. I did not stay there. I stayed with the UN for a while, and when I pulled into town, same situation, curfew, get off the streets. I pulled up to the UN, and they said, "Oh, the journalists can't stay here." I said, "I'm not a journalist." I'm like, "What? I'm a tourist, right?" And they're like, "What the hell?" So I stayed there, and my guy showed up, my driver showed up the next day, and apparently the Talibs had followed him home, went through every inch of his house, wherever, found my camera stuffed in the back of his car, beat the living daylights out of him. He negotiated something, either with a bribe or something, to not let them smash the camera, and then he brought it to me, so I gave him like $300 or something like that. But you didn't realize the repression of the Talibs, right, until you got these little details that the locals told you about.
Yeah, it was, we had our kind of first real run-in, well, after that traffic incident, but we went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they basically said, you can take pictures of anything as long as it's not living. So, well, okay. And I was saying, well, I didn't come all this way just to take pictures of flowers and rocks and buildings. So
they make you get a picture, which is forbidden, to put in your visa, which I always thought was very humorous.
It was such a shame, as they had all the guys who had the camera shops there were just covered in dust. It was such a shame. Passport or ID pictures were the only thing that were allowed.
A beard at the time?
I did.
And did Pepe have a beard?
Yeah, we were all pretty bearded up at that point.
I had a millennial beard. I had like a finger's worth. And those bastards used to stop you on the street. They had these little electrical cables that they'd taken off of high wires, and they were wrapped in tape.
That had to be this long, wasn't it? I can't remember.
No, they did this. It's 3 or this. But anyway, so they would stop me, and I looked like a Sasquatch, barreling down the street, and they would try to stop me, and I would say, "Mullah Omar is my good friend," right? And they'd do this, and I'd go like, "I'm working on it." I knew what that was in Farsi. And the funny thing is that they were a little intimidated of Westerners. The locals, they had no problem beating the hell out of them, right? Like when the call to prayer came, if somebody was still on the street, they'd just start whacking them around the back of the legs, and women, they didn't care, kids. And there were a lot of very violent things going on. Not so much because they would just kill people randomly, but you remember they had no prisons, right? So they would execute people in the stadiums, or stadium on Friday, and that was where all the journalists went, where all the secret footage and stuff like that.
That's where we kind of had our next run-in with them, because we got to the stadium. There was a football match between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I don't think thankfully there hadn't been any executions scheduled. But obviously the place it's got that reputation.
2000, and I was there a little earlier than that, but they would sit outside. It had Olympic rings on the outside, which made people think it was like an Olympic stadium. So the Talibs would sit outside, and these families would come to them with their complaints, and they say, okay, this guy stole my car, let's say, right? And so you either had to pay blood money, or you decided the punishment they would have. And there's a very famous image of an older woman getting shot in the back of the head, right? Yeah. Well, that woman had killed her husband with an axe while he was sleeping, and they didn't have any money to pay for her to get off, right? And there were a number of amputations of the thieves and stuff like that. Yeah. So you could argue that it was their only way of doing justice, but it was a gold mine for the foreign networks, right, like CNN. And I remember this one documentary, and you probably remember it, where it was like a woman went to Afghanistan and she couldn't film, but she secretly filmed, and she used this footage. Well, when I was there, the Talibs would say, take a picture of that, take a picture of this, take a goddamn heck Machar, look what these guys did, look what Masood did, take a picture of this, come over here. It was actually the opposite. They wanted me to document the things that had happened over the last few years with the warlords, right? Because that destruction was basically Hekmatyar and Masood and Dostum and all these people leveling the city to the ground. And the Talibs, who were mostly from the south, were furious at how badly that city had been treated. But anyway, continue. So your goal was what? Did you have an agenda? Like, did you go to that guy with the yellow taxi to go to the front lines? And
yeah, it was just, we'd hired this lovely old guy who had the correct beard length, and he had one of these little Toyota minivans, and he'd driven journalists around for a number of years, so he was quite a favour with the sort of things that we want to do and what we want to see and that stuff. So he got us to the stadium, we jumped out, and we ended up sitting with these sort of young Afghans, and they were just, I'd got my Contax G2, my little 35mm camera around my neck, and they were like, oh, take some pictures. And I was like I was trying to explain to them that, especially in that environment, that, I didn't want to get them into trouble and everything else. But anyway, I start taking a few pictures. Next minute, we are like surrounded by the Vice and Virtue department, who are the big motherfuckers. The players are all sort of coming off the pitch at that point, so we're getting bundled between sort of the players, these young Afghan kids who are sort of trying to sort of protect us in a way, and we get bundled into that pickup truck, and we're taken off to the Vice and Virtue department, and we're kind of, so the lawyer Jurga, we're sat down on the big carpet, and that, asking us what we're doing, why we're taking pictures and all this kind of stuff. But at that time, I decided that the best thing to do would just be to kill the pictures I've got on the camera. So I kind of popped the back of the camera. And so anyway, I handed them the camera, and the back pulled open, and then they pulled the film out and started to try and look at it against the sun to see if there was anything on there. So I thought, oh,
to do the swap out, I always had an empty roll in my pocket.
I did that later. Unfortunately, that moment we were like trapped in the back of this truck, and I couldn't really do anything. But then we thought, oh, okay, we're kind of fine. And I think the problem was then Pepe had probably a little video camera like yours, one of those small Sonys with the flip screen on it. And they got hold of that. And the thing was, he had got footage from the day before, and we'd been invited into this Hazara family's home. And we'd done made an interview with these 3 young Hazara girls, and they were talking about, obviously the struggles of, they were barely going outside and all of this. So I thought, oh shit, if they get hold of that, then okay, we might just get kicked out of the country, but it's going to be severe retribution on this young family, which that was all I was thinking about.
Also for your guide, it's also for your guide and your driver. Those are the guys they pick on. Yeah.
Absolutely. But luckily enough, Pepe somehow was able to fast forward the tape, and when he handed it to them, he pressed the button and the screen just was blue, and he said, look, there's nothing on here. And they actually accepted that. But they gave us a good grilling. It's like, you know the rules and all this kind of thing. Don't let us catch
Did
you
they
again."
bless you with the idea, like you must show the reality and all this jibber jabber they used to do?
I think they were just, I don't think they went down that route. They were just, very, very suspicious of us, and and we had all our papers from the, from the ministries, so that was fine. But yeah, they really were, I don't know, there's sort of a level of sort of ignorance and hatred all wrapped up into one. But once they said, okay, you guys can go, just make sure we don't want to find you ever again doing anything, yada yada. Anyway, we get in the minivan, and we're all like kind of sighing a big sigh of relief. And as we get up to the checkpoint to get out of the Vice and Virtue department, this guy comes sort of strolling up to the window, and I was like, oh shit, they're going to pull us back for something. I want to search more stuff. And the guy leans into the window and says something to our old driver. And anyway, the gate opens and we disappear off. We said, what was all that about? And the guy said, that this Afghan ministry guide said, please tell your friends that they're our guests, and I really apologize for the behavior of these people. They are not Afghans. They're not real Afghans, and we would never ever treat our guests that way, so please apologize to your friends.
Good point, because the Talibs were Southerners. A lot of them were Pakistanis. They weren't Kabulis, right? And Kabul to them was like Las Vegas. That was like Sin City, and these damn people without their hijabs and whatever. And they were not liked by the Afghans in Kabul at all. And
yeah, I think they definitely saw them as foreigners, especially the Pakistani, the Afghans who had been brought, been sort of tutored as such in the madrasas in Pakistan and got radicalized and brought in. They didn't know the culture, like you said. Most of them were, there are a lot of Pashtuns from the
Farm Boys.
Yeah.
And now, did you go out to the front lines and see the war?
Well, at that time, there wasn't really much going on. So what we decided to do, we thought we'd do a road trip. So we left Kabul, and then we drove down through Ghazni to Kandahar. Spent a couple of days in Kandahar, which was quite eye-opening, because there you saw that there was sort of the Talibs felt very comfortable there. So comfortable that they'd be, often sort of walking around, as you probably saw, with their coal eyeliner, the backs of their sandals undone, and fopping around with their little boys, hanging out at juice bars with very young men.
It's the weirdest culture, because it's, there's the South, right, the Pashtuns, and then there's the North, and then they have very similar looking, attributes, but the Kandaharis are considered to be just like these reprobates, right? These louches that are not real Afghans, like not the horse riding tough guy northern Afghans.
Yeah, they were very. I mean, you can see them sort of sauntering down the street with their back of the sandals undone, just sort of, almost mincing down the road with their little boys. So.
Well, so one interesting thing. At that time, so when I was there, it took them 3 days to catch me, right? Because I was hiding out at the UN. I was just doing whatever I wanted. The UN was running these tours for these mostly female journalists that would fly in from Pakistan. They'd be met by this little black Mercedes limo, and the UN had like this sort of rote thing they did where they went to the barber who was out of business because he didn't cut beards anymore. They went to the secret girls' school that was hiding from the Taliban. They went to either the execution, or they gave them footage from Rawa, which was a
That's
sort of
Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association.
Totally left-wing Marxist, sort of anti-whatever. But the point was that it was a very standardized script, because the Talibs hated the NGOs, and I didn't realize this until I sat with hung out with all the commanders and the politicians. They said that these Westerners live in mansions, which was true. The UN was in a mansion. They had swimming pools and waiters, and they spent millions of dollars, and none of that was coming to the actual Afghans. And one guy in particular, because I was doing some demining, and he said, like, the budget for the demining here is like $10 million for this section. He said, I could do that for $5,000. I said, well, how would you do it? I said, I would drive a tank back and forth. I said, well, what happens when you hit a mine? He said, I don't know. We haven't figured out that yet. So they had this idea, and the reason why they blew up the Buddhas, which is not a story many people talk about, is that there was actually a famine in Afghanistan when I was there. And it was the Danish or some NGO had put in X millions of dollars to fix up the Buddhas when the Talibs are there. And of course, the Talibs don't like that whole Buddhist culture, and they definitely don't like the Hazaras that live in that valley. So the Talibs said, you either give us that money or we're going to blow up the Buddhas. And they said, no, we're an NGO, we don't do that. And so they blew up the Buddhas. There was a battle for the millions of dollars that flowed into Afghanistan, and the Taliban was trying to get a hold of that. They were not anti-American. They didn't rail about, evil America, because America technically had helped them get rid of the Soviets. So I found them very welcoming, very, very ignorant about most of the things in the world, and really sad, because when you really sat down with the Taliban and they told you stories about being kids, talking about their villages being gassed and their families being executed. I mean, just some really weird stuff that never really made the mainstream. So I thought the Taliban were hoping that America would sort of come back and see this whole sort of guns, pickup trucks, and religious zealotness as being sort of a cultural link between the two nations. But bin Laden screwed all that.
Well, there's definitely some sort of crossover between some of my old buddies back in Texas with beards and pickup trucks and guns. So.
Yeah. So now you're doing a really good. You're doing an in-depth story. You're traveling throughout Afghanistan. Were you going to monetize this, like when you took all these pictures?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, Pepe was still working for the Estado de Sao Paulo. So yeah, the idea was that the trip at that point was going to be being funded on the most part by them, and then we'd sell the story. But what happened when we got all the way to Herat? So.
And by the way, that's impressive at that time. That was a...
Yeah, I mean, it was a hell of a road trip. I mean, yeah, we did get arrested again, actually. I forgot to mention. We got to Razni on the way down, and there's those gorgeous minarets, you might remember. And right near them, there was it was sort of a dumping ground for old military vehicles, like just a huge scrap yard. So I thought, oh, that's a great picture. So we got the driver to pull over, and we thought, well, that's fairly safe. There's no people, so they can't get into trouble because they're, there's no faces. So of course we get down there and we're, sort of climbing in the tanks, getting pictures, and there was a kind of one of the Cyrillic plates from one of the Soviet tanks. I thought I need a little souvenir, so I took that, and then there was this sort of big mud compound which it looked empty. So I thought I'll get a good picture. I'll climb up on the wall, and then I'll get sort of an overview shot of this sort of minaret with this tower, and then there's some shepherds walking by and all these blown up helicopters and cannibalized vehicles. And I get up there and I was like, there's you would probably know what it is, but it's sort of a machine gun on a tripod, and I called down to Howard. I said, this thing looks really new. This is not a rusted old thing that's just laying up there. So he said, get down. So I jumped down. Next minute, out of the compound come a whole bunch of little guys. And of course, they have a field day with us. And that was the point when I'd learned my lesson. So I was sort of holding back and rewinding the camera. And then I switched the film out. And so we got held for the afternoon. And Howard... Mehdi, the Pakistani journalist, he spun a whole long story about how his cousins had been fighting for the Taliban, had been killed, and all this stuff, and eventually they said, okay, well, you're on your way. So it was another little bit of their hospitality.
So not to minimize your trip, but you did quite an impressive thing, and you probably have a pretty impressive portfolio of images from the Taliban era. When you came back, what was your sense that this was what you wanted to do, or this is something that nobody cares about, or what kind of reaction did you have to your portfolio after that?
I think it was a life-changing trip, but it was also the idea was at the end of that trip I'd been to the Afghan mission in New York prior to that, so the idea was we would come back into Pakistan, and then we'll probably go up to Tajikistan and then go and see Masood. But once we crossed the border back into Pakistan, Pepe had got the news that his boss at the newspaper had got into some kind of I don't know the whole ins and outs, but basically he'd been arrested for shooting his girlfriend. So Pepe was like, "Well, there goes my job." It wasn't quite as ambivalent as that, but it was very shocking. And then but the next day we drove up to Islamabad, and I called my mum, and that's when I found out my brother had been killed in an accident the day before, in just outside of London. So both Pepe and I were pretty shaken up, and we were like, okay, well, I think we both need to sort of head back and sort our lives out. And so we took a break, and the next year we decided, okay, we've got to go and see Masood, which...
Just to reference this, we're talking about what year, what month?
So we're talking August 2001. So we tried to get in initially.
You are cutting it close here, August 2001.
Yeah, well, we we met again up in Islamabad, and the idea was that we would actually cross with horses, and so we got dressed up as women in burqas, and they drove us into the kind of the no man's land. And Pepe had this big afro, so his sort of burqa looked like he'd got encephalitis or something underneath it.
Did you still have the beard?
Yeah, it was.
But this is the soul of adventures. Instead of just getting on a plane or a helicopter and flying in, you got to do something stupid because it makes it more interesting.
Even that route, how that actually came together. But I think it was through.
So just so you know, you're a victim of bad history. So that route, the one that went the back door over into the Panjshir Valley.
That way.
Yeah, that was the old Mujahideen route from the 80s, right? They used to run donkeys up. They used to carry cars up there, and it goes way up high into the mountains. And one of the most famous, Sandy Gall. You remember Sandy Gall?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
He used to do these BBC reports, and I think the most famous one was, I think in the 80s or 90s. I'm not sure. You have to check. But he does that thing where everybody's freezing and the donkeys are dying, and this set the standard for an entire collection of journalists to recreate that idea, that take the Mujh path up into the Panjshir Valley. Now that's the backside of the Panjshir Valley, right?
Okay. So we basically I've got an aeroplane going over.
Lucky you. But instead of doing it the normal way, because what I was going to say is that by the mid-90s, let's say 96, the CIA and Iran were working with Masood. And they were running an old Mi-8, might have been an Mi-17, I'm not sure, old Russian helicopter from Dushanbe into Talokan, right? And the Talibs were trying to shoot those down with these two jet fighters they had based in Kabul. You would have seen them at the airport when you walked by. There's weird-looking little Russian Sukhois. But I spent 3 years trying to see Masood, going all the wrong ways, right? And I did a whole documentary about it, which is fun to watch. But it's like finally when I hooked up with Peter Juvenal, and we just went the normal way, which is essentially you go to Dushanbe, you get checked out by intelligence, right? The guys with the leather jackets. You wait in your hotel, and they tell you, okay, come, and then off you go, and you fly in, and they try to shoot you down, but the guy does all these things, and like there you are, and you see all the crashed helicopter, or actually shot down and burnt helicopters when you land. Yeah. But you wanted to do it the hard way. You wanted to do it the 80s way, because you're old school.
Yeah, and I like horses. Having lived in Texas for a while, I got into horses. So I thought that
horses, those are just skinny donkeys.
Yeah. So we actually didn't even get to go on the horses. Is the whole rub of it. We ended up being told that there was a commander called Ashabek who was going to come down and meet us in this valley. We would be sitting in some farmer's house, and then we'll be picked up. And we waited until late at night, wondering what the hell's going on. And then some kid shows up at the door with a little note that is translated to us to say, if you've crossed the border, pay $100. If you haven't crossed the border, don't. And it was just didn't make any sort of real sense whether that translation was even close. But we realized that we were just dumped in no man's land. And
Chitral at this time? What town are you in?
I don't even know where we were. Yeah, we'd gone through Chitral. Yeah, we'd gone through Chitral, and then we basically just crossed into this no man's land, and we were sat in this guy's farm. So the problem was to get us back out, because we'd already gone through the checkpoints once dressed as women. So the next day there was this sort of almost like 4-wheel drive taxi service that went around the valley for the farmers and things. So we got some burqas and went back to Islamabad. And anyway, to cut a long story short,
Did you just explain to the unwashed public, why do you have to dress up like women to be snuck in? Don't you just like get snuck in as journalists?
That was the way they said that we needed to get through the checkpoint into this sort of no man's land to get picked up. They advised that was the best way of doing it. And it might have been just them having a lot of fun seeing silly white guys getting dressed up in women's clothes.
Tell you as sex slaves with bearded women.
Yeah. They might have just watched too much Monty Python at some point. But
So do you get it? You get in. How do you get in?
Yeah. So eventually we did the sensible thing is just get to Dushanbe, and we waited for a good week. As everyone does, they string you along every day. They come and say that we're going today, and they even left a note one time. There was a lovely guy called Asum Suhail, and he worked for the Northern Alliance, and he'd left this note for us. He knew we had gone out, and left this note saying, "I'm really sorry, guys, but you've missed the helicopter. Better luck next time. Come back next year."
This was all theatrics, by the way. Masood,
Yeah.
and this is what killed Masood, of course, is that these journalists would show up, and in order to maintain the fiction that it was hard to meet or interview Masood, you would sit, and they would make you do all kinds of stupid things, like go here, interview that, go there, do this, whatever. And then at the last minute, like, hurry, you do your thing. And then you realize that Masood, like, literally lives over the wall from the guest house that you've been staying in for 2 weeks. And that's when he got blowed up, But anyway, so continue, because you're...
We spent a few weeks in the Panjshir. We got to spend a little bit of time with Masood, but definitely not enough. And got to photograph him. Pepe did an interview, and we did actually during that waiting time. It was kind of cool. We decided to go up and go and meet some of the Kuchis, some of the nomads, and we went up there with I think it was with Baba Khan's guys. I think he was the guy that ended up. I think Masood sort of not sacked him for a while, but I think he ended up killing some Taliban prisoners. And yeah,
More pictures? You want more pictures?
Yeah. So anyway, we organised with him that we would get up to go into this. It's called the Khawlak Valley, and we would go and spend a few days with these Kuchi nomads. But we would go in with these Northern Alliance fighters with their horses and guns, and that was it was just extraordinary. I mean, you did feel like you were kind of in the Wild West out there. It was super remote, and the nomads.
You were in the guest house. Were there other journalists there?
So that was the thing. When we were, I think what they were doing, they were waiting to gather up enough people for that helicopter to come in. So we actually had the mayor of Geneva was with us, a woman that was coming in with a stack of money. Literally sort of a suitcase full of money to give Masood to set up a school, and then there was another photographer, an Italian guy, and a couple of other sort of people part of this entourage from Geneva.
Heavy media schedule, and I think the most famous documentary, because it was promoted the most, was Sebastian Junger and Reza. Remember the photographer Reza?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know Reza. Yeah.
Yeah. So he went in, and I think it was a couple of months before Masood got blowed up, but he was doing a lot of media at the time, and then there was a lot of very negative media about the Talibs, right? but they were still maintaining this ridiculous war where they would fire rockets into the city, and they're on the fields down below in the Shamali Plains. They would have skirmishes, but it was kind of like a fake war. They'd rocket each other and they'd send artillery, and I remember sitting on the front lines getting shelled, and the Talibs wouldn't even they wouldn't even hide. They were just like, Allah will protect us, and I'm like, those are artillery shells. Yeah, but they're Iranian artillery shells. They always fell short or they went too far, and it was a very strange war.
It was. We ended up going to Bagram, where you and I ended up in 2008.
Baba Jam was the guy.
Yeah, that was kind of the front line there, and it was quite amusing. The Northern Alliance would be chatting with the Talibs, and the Talibs were saying, "Oh, we know you've got guests. We can see them."
Bullets. So Baba John used to run Bagram back when it was like an old Russian air base, and we go out in the front lines, and you go further and further and further, and I could see the position I was sitting on with the Taliban like a couple of years earlier, and they would know that journalists were coming out. When I say journalists, me, and they would fire some rockets. And they knew that the journalists needed like footage, and I could do not fire the rockets because you're sending them into the city, randomly killing civilians. And I just thought it was a very strange. This is my first experience of war as a theatrical event designed to do PR, right? Like we're fighting, for freedom and whatever. But in actual fact, the Taliban were trying to disarm the militaries and stop them from fighting over the control of the government. So it was a very strange narrative at that time. So when you came back from Massoud, did you have Massoud-itis, like the great leader, the great rebel Mao Che?
He's as you well know. I mean, he definitely had a presence and a certain charisma around him, and I'd like to
where we had a deaf mime.
Cool, kind of up here in his nice shiny French shoes or Italian shoes, whatever he had. He looked very, very. He looked the part for sure. So
he used to quote Mao, and I guess the CIA told him to quote George Washington instead when he's being. But you were there. I forget when he got blown up. It was September 9th or something, or 10th.
I photographed him on the 9th of September.
Wait. Let me get this right. So you photographed him when?
On August the 9th.
Literally 1 month before he got killed.
Yeah. So surreal Shangri-La. Obviously you got the beautiful Panjshir River to swim in, and it's just a lovely.
Taloqan had those horse carriages with the little bells, and it felt like you're in Shangri-La, like you say, but 200 years earlier, right?
Yeah, and then you sort of have that. Then you sort of see the tank that's been half dumped into the river, and bits of helicopters, and so there's all this, kind of slightly jarring remnants of really the atrocities and things that had happened probably during the Soviet times.
Well, we used to get bombed. Did you get bombed?
We weren't that lucky, so.
We'd be sitting there and you hear this boom, and then this jet fighter, those two jets that they had, and they would rant. And I used to go out to where they bombed. It's just what a stupid war. Anyway, so but here's the thing that I want the listeners to understand is that you were part of a very early group of people trying to understand this thing called Afghanistan, the jihadis, the mujahideen, and there weren't that many people focused on this sort of aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan war. But I think you might be one of the very few people that did the triptych, the Taliban, Massoud, and then 9/11. All right, so
Right.
One of the things that I find unique about you is that you have sort of the holy trinity of the 9/11 experience, in that you were with the Taliban in Kabul, you were with Massoud, Northern Alliance, in I don't know if it was Taloqan or wherever he was. And you were also in Manhattan on 9/11. So tell me your 9/11 story.
Well, we left Afghanistan kind of near the latter part of August. Went back through Pakistan, and we thought, okay, well, let's start trying to pitch the story. So I went back to New York on, I think it was September the 5th. I got back, and I went to see my agent, which was Corbis at the time, and we tried to get some traction on the pictures and maybe a bit of a package from from the previous year's trip and the Northern Alliance trip. Didn't really get any takers on it at all. There just didn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in Afghanistan.
Clarify this, so because people that watch this will be fascinated that you were prescient, right? You went to places that would later on be in the news, but at the time you were finding no economic reception or even creative reception for what you'd put together and spent your own money on.
Your own money.
Yeah. I mean, it was. I think, this idea of, I think it was sort of pushed into me early on that you've got to kind of invest in your own work. You can't just wait for assignments. As I didn't really have much of a track record of any sorts, and to get anyone to actually send me to these places was, it was sort of pretty much nil. So often people would say, "Oh, great, that's great, you're going. Let's see what you've got when you get back," kind of thing. But they were, you were doing it on a huge leap of faith. But it was also, part of my sort of training, my learning experience. And it was also just as much as you've probably funded a lot of your own trips where it's a deep desire to learn, to explore, to try and understand for your own eyes and not just rely on what someone else has written or.
Well, remember Explorer, I've done work for National Geographic, and they had decided, hey, let's send Sebastian Younger, who was quite famous at the time, had written about Afghanistan, had spent a lot of time, I think at Men's Journal, and trying to figure out how to get into Afghanistan, so I helped him with his trips. And the Reza, who was a very famous European photographer, not so much American, decided to go together as a team and sort of replicate what you had done, but make it more of a filmic adventure with Sebastian. And it was a great documentary. And the timing was like scary, it was almost the same time you were there. So I'm actually surprised that you didn't bump into him. And there was a woman who had done something for CNN, which was again about how terrible the Taliban were. So they had these two narratives in the public arena. I had done a documentary about seeing Massoud. I'm sure people watched it. It was interesting, but it wasn't relevant. It was just a Discovery Channel thing on the Travel Channel that, like, oh, there's Robert going to yet another, dangerous place. But it's September 10th. It would be almost impossible to sell that idea into what I would call the creative or mainstream media.
Yeah, it was. It was. I don't know. We got back. I was pretty despondent, really, that no one was picking up on all this work, and I thought this is such an extraordinary place. We've had amazing access. I've got a great writer that we're working with Pepe, and it just seemed. I don't know. I was like, oh shit, I've got to go back to Victoria's Secret again.
Were you at this time?
Sorry?
How old were you? And
I was 31, so.
the time that you should be choosing your profession. So tell me about the September 11th. Tell me how it's.
Sorry, I was. Hang on, I'm getting my time mixed up here. So I would have been, 36 actually. Sorry, yeah.
You're old and washed up.
Yeah, oldie. I was already pretty knackered, but.
So September 11th. So you've got these pictures you can't sell. You've done probably the most amazing travel of your life, right? Experiences.
Yeah. No, it was. I was just. I came back. I'd say a changed person, but again, more. My eyes had been opened, and it just felt like I was on the path that I was supposed to be on, really. So despite not selling the pictures, it was still an amazing experience, and I was very happy with the work that I got out of there. And so I got a call on the I think it was either the 9th or the 10th of September to say that Massoud had been assassinated, and so I called the guy I knew at the Afghan ministry that was in. It was sort of the Northern Alliance sort of office as such in New York, and the chap there said, no, he's Massoud's fine, don't worry. It was an incident, but he's going to be absolutely
Right, they were lying to everyone.
Yeah.
First day or so.
That morning, we heard a plane go over very, very low, and I thought, that's strange. Didn't think too much about it. Then my phone rings not very long afterwards, and it was David Laidler, who was my agent at Corbis. And he said, look, I know you live downtown. Do you think you could just get down to the World Trade Center? Something's happened down there. So I grabbed my kit, and my girlfriend at the time was a videographer, so she grabbed her camera, ran to my apartment to get the rest of my kit and some film, and Oscar the Italian. So we all kind of started racing towards the Twin Towers. I think Jeannie she'd pulled back at that point. Oscar was in his Birkenstocks and shorts, so he got so far down and said, look, I think I need to go and get changed. So I just kept going, and I got all the way down to Vesey Street, which was pretty much at the foot of the World Trade Center next to number 7. By that point, both planes had hit the towers, and we realized then it wasn't just a light aircraft that we thought was the first thing, or maybe one of the tourist helicopters. And so I got to the foot of the towers, which was about 10 minutes before the South Tower collapsed. And I was with some police officers and some firemen, and they said, well, we should pull back. And instead of sort of pulling away north, we actually turned on Vesey Street to the east. And I got halfway up the street, and next minute there's this, I can't even really describe the sound. It was just like a huge boom, and I thought, oh shit, there must have been a bomb inside the building. Didn't really think it was actually collapsing. It looked just like it was just, this huge plumes of dust and smoke. So I turned my camera behind me and just started running up Vesey Street, and I fired off about 3 or 4 wobbly frames with the camera behind me. And at the end of the block was one of the World Trade Center subway stations, and I literally just tumbled down the stairs, and all the dust came in on top. And at first I thought, I realised I had my beloved Contax G2, and realised a viewfinder had got smashed on it, and my Canon camera, the zoom had got knocked and had got jammed, and I was more worried about the equipment. And then I realised. Yeah, then I realised I couldn't bloody breathe because of this sort of, this dust was starting to accumulate. But there were a couple of other people down there, which I would love to find out who these folks were. I've got a very blurred picture of them kind of at the top of the steps of the World Trade Center subway station. And I think they were either MTA, the transit workers or police officers, but we kind of held on to each other. And we walked I think we'd get onto the track, but we ended up popping out on the other side of Broadway, and it was like a yellow snowstorm. I don't know why the light had very sort of orange colour to it. Maybe your memory plays strange things, but the light, it had a weird light to it. Everything was covered in dust.
You weren't the only guy down there. There was like a who's who of famous.
Absolutely, yeah. James Nachtwey was around the corner, and I bumped into. After we kind of got out from the subway station, some firemen They said, look, we're all pushing people to the. It's called the Stage Door Deli. So we went inside the Stage Door Deli. Everyone was sort of dousing themselves with water, and there was Ruth Frempson was in there. I didn't know who she was at the time, but she was one of the New York Times photographers. She actually won a Pulitzer for the photograph she took inside the deli. And so I think I spent about sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so in there, and I thought, well, I need to get out on the street, see what's going on. And there was an officer, a female officer, in a uniform which I didn't immediately recognize, and she was helping another officer who was on the floor. And I started taking pictures, and we've subsequently have two very different stories of what happened. I'm pretty sure she told me haven't you got anything better to effing do? And and so I took some pictures and sort of backed off. But anyway, it was about a month later, I get a call from my agent, and the picture I'd taken of her got published with MSNBC, and she asked if she could have a copy of it. So we stayed in loose contact, but it wasn't
10 years later when I
wanted to make a little documentary with another British friend of mine, a photographer who was down there. and with
One person we'd photographed
on that day, and anyway, I finally kind of got properly introduced to the officer. Her name was Patricia Mack, and what I didn't know until then, that she had literally climbed out of the rubble of.
And she called it I guess it was a transit authority, a police officer?
Yeah, Patty Mack was actually a court officer. So she was working at the court downtown, and when the towers collapsed, she went straight into to start helping people. But she had actually gone into the South Tower, and she was with one of her senior officers, and she described that they basically got. She was, unbelievably lucky. I mean, she got kind of as the tower collapsed, she ended up sort of in a pocket, as such, of debris. Unfortunately, the senior officer got killed, but she, climbed out fairly unscathed. But then, she was immediately working with, with the emergency services, trying to assist other people.
So your story is sort of unique, and suddenly you're a photographer trying to get known for doing adventure and exotic, things. When you were taking these pictures, was there also sort of a mercenary thought, like, this is it, I nailed it, I was there right at the center of everything, I've got great photos, I'm going to make a lot of money, or I'm going to be famous? Like, what was your sort of commercial thinking at the time after doing all this?
I think at the very moment it happened, I was just going, fuck, that was really, really close. I mean, I got way too close. And thankfully I didn't get down there, maybe 10 minutes sooner, because Bill Biggett was one of the photographers who got killed. I mean, he obviously got down there before me, and he'd gone right down onto the plaza at the foot of the tower. When I got there, it was 10 minutes before the first collapse. But in a way, that was probably a good thing that I hadn't got down there any sooner, really. And then I was.
At the end of the day, though, your agent, Corbis, which is a stock photo, and they can get these things out pretty quickly. Did they get your photos out on the marketplace, and did people buy them, or was there a surplus of 9/11 pictures?
I think once I got, because I'd just come from Afghanistan, I was only shooting black and white. So everyone else was shooting color. I did shoot I think I had a roll of color in my camera, but I literally just grabbed what I had and shoved it into my bag and went running down. But in a way, I'm quite. I how can I put it? The color pictures don't really do anything for me at all. They sort of lack. My ones personally lacked a certain atmosphere. The black and white ones to me felt like the day. When I look at them, I can kind of, it's more the emotion of the day comes out in those pictures.
In my opinion, your photos of 9/11 are incredible, right? They're very ghostly and powerful, but that's not necessarily what people traffic in, right? So when a magazine...
No, that was, I mean, the stuff that went onto the cover of Time magazine were those, blue sky, big colorful explosions, but the work actually got picked up by Libération, the French newspaper. So they ran quite a big spread of all the pictures. So the French seem to maybe understand the black and white more than the Italians. Sorry, than the Americans. Yeah.
I remember in the 90s there was the big scoop was like get a double spread in Paris Match. That was 10 grand, and that would fund you for an entire year of other stupid projects, right? And Americans didn't, like Life and all these people, they very rarely use stock photos. They would typically use their own people.
Yeah.
And I just, looking backwards, your collection of photos from the Taliban, the Massoud, and 9/11, it should be in a museum, right? Because you were there at the time, in the right place at the right time. So.
Yeah. There was. I mean, it was a strange. I think I described. Someone asked me before. It said. I think it was sort of my. I don't know. A little bit of a quote was, sort of went to Afghanistan to find a war and I didn't find anything. Get back to New York a few days later and the wars come to me. So it did feel very strange that suddenly the world felt super connected and quite small.
In my bathrobe on the I lived on the ocean, and I was having my coffee looking up at the TV in the kitchen, and I saw the second plane fly in, and I said, oh, the bastards finally did it. I knew exactly who did it because they tried it earlier. And I thought that was brilliant, right? I mean, it's
Oh, the audacity of it is just, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing that they could conceive it and somehow get away with it, so.
well, my avocation, which was going to crappy little places where people were fighting wars that didn't matter, of which Afghanistan was one of them, suddenly became really important. And I remember Discovery saying, didn't you do a documentary about Massoud and Taliban? I'm like, yeah, I did, you know, and I spent a lot of time and money doing it. So they dusted me off to do a special edition, you know, like do an intro and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you went through that sort of reimagining, because suddenly there was a very small group of people that could even talk about Afghanistan, let alone had been there, right? So I don't, did your career pick up, or was there some kind of sea change in how you reviewed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was, people wanted the Afghan pictures, which they didn't want before. You know, I get I think it was Talk magazine, which was, Tina Brown's magazine that she took on. She spearheaded after working at the New Yorker, and they gave me like a ton of pages and a very nice paycheck, and we did a
Nice paycheck. Like, let's say those pictures, did it pay for your trip? Like, did you make enough money?
Yeah, that was, I think they paid, I think it was around about $7,000 or $8,000. So that definitely helped. That paid for the trip for sure. And then I'd also photographed in one of Massoud's, one of the Northern Alliance prisons, which he probably went to, and the Globe and Mail newspaper. Yeah, it's an interesting bunch of people in there. I mean, it was Yemenis, Iraqis. It was a real, hodgepodge. There was Uyghurs, Chinese Uyghurs there.
I talked to him all. Did you meet the crazy guy who quoted Bollywood movies and Siddhartha?
But I did meet a. There was a. I'm not sure what are we allowed to call midgets, or he had dwarfism, and it was like a little dwarf talib, which was just extraordinary. And these guys are all sort of thrown together.
We call those Afghans.
Afghans. Yeah.
That's a common. You see quite a few short Afghans. So. But did you get sort of, I don't know how you went around and got business, but when you knocked on doors, was like, oh man, this is a guy to talk to, right? Or was it just like no big deal that you'd been?
I think at that point, I mean, it was, I think I was, saying I was a go-to person. I wouldn't really say that, but I mean, I got invited to, to do some talks and exhibitions, and, the work got published. So, that's what I wanted. I wanted to get the work out there, and unfortunately, it took September 11th for that work to get published, which is
it validated your original idea of leaving behind the supermodels and then going after things that were less rewarding financially, but more rewarding, emotionally and career-wise. So 2001. I was sort of a go-to guy because my website just shot through the roof. My book just exploded because it was the only thing that told you about the Taliban, right? And the only thing that explained who Massoud was. And I remember one guy saying that your website is like one of the top 10 websites in the world, which was Come Back Alive.
What was the, I forget the name you had of it was sort of almost like a messaging.
Black Flag Cafe, Black Flag Cafe.
Black Flag, of course, yeah. Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant.
Literally, when you Googled Taliban, that was the only thing you could find that explained it. And I kept thinking that, I'm sure the military is going to call me, like some kind of expertise. And never. The only people that called me were New York City police were tracking some like skanky Talib guy that was smuggling heroin in rugs or whatever. But it became... like, we have to send Robert Pelton back to Afghanistan. So there were a lot of people fighting the networks, right? Fighting over, who would hire me, how much they'd pay me. and I ended up working for National Geographic, CNN, and Discovery all at the same time. But they all kept dragging their butts because they're like, oh, we need to get insurance, we need to get this approved by the, and I'm like, okay, suddenly the thing that I did on a whim with my own money is now a corporate bureaucracy. So did you get that kind of like, we need you to get back to Afghanistan or cover women's rights and all this kind of stuff? Or
You know, at that point, it sounds like a strange thing, but I didn't go back at that time. It just felt to me it was going to be, I do kick myself for not going sooner, but I felt I was going to be kind of a dog and pony show. You know, those couple of the years that we went there, we felt we had the place to ourselves and it was very unique. But I think that...
Right? When everybody thought they were going to go get famous by getting a scoop or whatever, they were all bottled up in Pakistan and up in Tashkent in Uzbekistan and somewhere in Tajikistan because they blocked journalists. So I just happened to go because I knew the warlords and they said, yeah, come on over. You know, we're fighting over here, we're fighting over there. So I got in and there were no journalists there because they were literally told to, if you see a journalist, arrest them. And here I was with the Special Forces team and dossed them. But everybody thought it was going to be like, you know, the classic war correspondent gig. And it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, I mean, some people...
Maybe that applies.
Yeah, some people did some amazing... Yeah, there was some amazing work that came out of there for sure. But at that point, I was kind of getting... My focus was looking more towards Africa.
So that's the dumbest thing you ever did because you had invested all this time and effort.
Yeah.
And this was the hungriest media you've ever seen in your life. They had no stock photos other than like Robert King and, you know, a few people here and there. I never sold my photos, right? I always kept my photos. I didn't distribute them. But they were so hungry for stories about Afghanistan. You had to get over there right away and do all this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go back again until 2008 when I first met you. So that was the... And it felt such, it felt such a different place. You know, the 2 years, despite the restrictions of the Taliban, and you know, it suddenly felt I wasn't really in Afghanistan. We were just, you know, behind those big HESCO walls, and I don't know. It was a very interesting trip, but it was so different from the freedom that we had in the early days of being able to move around. And
Dangerous thing was the narrative. So the thing that I noticed was, you know, I went over there. I was not embedded. I signed no papers. I had no deals. Dostum remembered me as the guy that was trying to get in while he was trying to flee when the Taliban went up to Mazar. So he remembers me as that crazy guy that was trying to get in to see him. I was going to hang out with the guy that ran Herat, but he said, there's no fighting over here, so you might as well hang out with Dostum. Massoud was dead. I knew all the Northern Alliance people, but that's not where the action was, right? So the action was up in the hills. So when I showed up, it was literally the night of Kali Jangi, you know, the big bombing and
The prison there, huh?
yeah, and that was probably the biggest battle of the war. And I'm in the middle of this thing, and I'm trying to tell CNN what's going on, and they don't believe me. And I'm just like, I can't believe this, because their narrative was America's coming to rescue Afghanistan and liberate all the women, right? And we're like, no, that's not what's happening here at all, right? So I found it was very funny, and then, you know, my claim to fame, my first job as sort of a paying journalist was I did that interview with John Walker Lind, and
That's
he was,
right, yeah.
So I was, you know, just hanging around, walking around. It's a horrible place. I mean, dead bodies everywhere, but there were some people hiding under a pink house, and I said, hey, when these guys come out, because they were hiding there and they wouldn't come out. So when these guys come out, let me talk to them, because I might know them, right? And as you know, in the jihadi trail, people know each other, right? They know, well, you went to this camp or you came from this country. So when Lind was brought up, he was with a whole bunch of other people. So there were two trucks. One was full of wounded and one was full of like terrified people. And I said, look, these people are all shot to shit, like just take them to the hospital. So when I did my interview, it was actually the second Irish-American jihadi, because I'd been to Chechnya with Akil, who was an Irish-American. When I called CNN, again, I said I got this interview with this American guy, and he's an Al-Qaeda guy. And it's just like, sure, well, we'll get back to you on that. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, so almost a half a day goes by, and they go, "Is that kid that was on the back of the truck that was on MSNBC?" I said, "Yeah, he's sleeping upstairs. Like, I brought him back with me." And they were like, "Oh my God, send us something," right? So we did that thing where you send up one frame at a time.
Yeah.
I think we sent up a couple, stayed up all night to send like 2 minutes. And apparently I wasn't here, but that was the big story, right? And the idea was it was an American, but they called him a Taliban. I said, no, he's not Taliban. He's an Al-Qaeda guy. He speaks Arabic. He's not Afghan. He's literally trained in Bin Laden's camp. And they then tried to pass this off to the Christian Amanpours and the various like things. And they wanted me to drive to Kabul from Mazar. And I'm like, you can't drive from Mazar to Kabul. There's a war going on in the middle. To do like nonstop interviews. And I kept saying, he's not a Talib. He's an Al-Qaeda. And I kept thinking the narrative is what's screwing this up, right? And the other narrative was the Special Forces team that I was with. We became very good friends. And their bosses said, get rid of this guy. And they said, no, he knows more about Afghanistan than we do. We'll keep him. And I noticed and I listened to what they were doing, and they were sending all these senior people to sort of claim this victory. And they even had Rumsfeld call him up and tell him to go to, K2 and meet with Rumsfeld for an interview and a photo op. And they said to me, Robert, they're going to steal our story. They're going to take what we actually did and turn it into something else. And it wasn't more than, 2 or 3 weeks before they were getting accused of war crimes, and all these journalists came, one of them being Sandy Gall's daughter, Carlotta Gall. And these stories about these massacres and containers, and I'm like, where the hell is this coming from? Because I was actually in that prison, right? And the reason I'm going on about this is that I was an eyewitness to many of the things that happened. And there were no other people from America there other than the soldiers and the CIA guys. And I watched how the press rewrote that so that Dostum and the Northern Alliance couldn't take over the government because they had their own little door guy from Pakistan, right? Karzai. And that was the thing about being there at the right time. Now, you were at the right time, the Taliban, you saw what they did, what they didn't do. You saw what Massoud did and didn't do. The hard part is keeping the narrative straight when everybody else sort of Bigfoots you with their version of the story. And at the time, when I was dealing with Discovery, rerunning my documentary about the Taliban, I kept saying, it's not about women's rights. The women have a terrible, terrible time in Afghanistan, as they do in Pakistan, as they do in some parts of India. But the whole place is destroyed. There are no schools for boys, let alone girls, right? And I tried to explain that this was an NGO construct where they would bring in people, they would write the story, because they were defending their rice bowl. They didn't want the money to go to the Talibs, they wanted to keep it. And again, right up till today, where guys like you who spend their own money, go there, they don't have an agenda, you just listen, photograph, take notes, whatever. It's really hard to perpetuate that kind of journalism. Just honest, like capture it, publish it, whatever. And I want to be able to tell people that watch this that it was worth it, did you feel like your investment, your time, your sort of putting aside a better paying career was worth it? And at what point did you think it was worth it?
It's a really good question. I think once that trip, like I said before, was kind of life-changing, and then obviously with September 11th, I did feel like I was on the right path, but it was, I wasn't taking a very traditional path in what I was doing. I wasn't working for a news agency full-time or, a staffer at the paper.
Right? You didn't become the Afghan guy.
No, I mean, that might have been my, my own downfall in a certain way. I just sort of, I'm not really a pack animal, so I didn't really feel like
It's called branding.
Yeah, yeah, that's to my own demise maybe, but I just felt, okay, well, there's all these other people are on it now, and I'll disappear off to Gambia in West Africa, and
You came from an industry in fashion where you have a brand, right? Like people that work in the fashion industry have a look, right? They have a day rate, they have a certain guarantee, like you hire me, put it on the cover, whatever picture it is,
Yeah.
whatever celebrity. And you ignored that, right? It's almost like you went too far away from that.
Yeah, I think there's probably decisions that I've made over time which I could have made probably better financial decisions. But I don't think I would, I think of all the things that I've done and seen and been able to do, I wouldn't change any of that really. And I don't think it's not, I think some people do photography and it's just it's a tool, it's a way to make money. But I think for me, it's, and probably a lot of the guys I know, it's a lifestyle. And it's more of a vocation than it is, if I wanted to make a load of money, I'd probably would have gone and worked on Wall Street. But that's just not the way I'm formed. I'm not really turned that way. I'm not excited about that. But what I am excited about is, kind of being on the ground, seeing things with my own eyes, and just being around, other human beings. It kind of puts your faith back in the world. I think we've got so isolated in the way we look at things, and we're seeing it around the world at the moment with this kind of othering, rather than with all the technology we have to help people, to bring people together. It's it's a divide and conquer state we're in at the moment, and I think from early on I thought I've got to see this stuff with my own eyes, and I'm sure it's the same with you. It's just the curiosity, and I think all of this stuff puts your faith back in humanity as much as we see the atrocities around the world.
I'll tell you something interesting. So when I was in Iraq, I was, unfortunately, I was working for 60 Minutes or ABC Investigative. I forget which one I was working for at the time. But they told me to sit tight in Jordan because you had to have an embed, right? You had to literally get a piece of paper from the military to document the war, which I always find humorous because there's more than one side in a war. But during that time, I was in all the hotels in Amman, and I like to say that I was the only person embedded with journalists during that war. And I counted the visas they issued in Jordan. So they have a number, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you come in, you have to say whether you're a journalist or a tourist or whatever. So there was one for tourists, and they're all trying to get to Iraq. I think they were up to 12,000. So imagine in 2003,
Yeah.
there were 12,000 war correspondents, right? Almost all of them with a chit from the military saying you can cover the 457th latrine cleaning, commandos, all sending articles back to newspapers and TV stations or whatever. But the impact was when you and I were in Afghanistan. In other words, when they were like a single person shows up in a place and documents something, like with the Taliban. And to be fair, there was sort of a trail heading towards Massoud when the CIA started to work with him, right? There was a constant flow of journalists coming in to write the same story. But it turned into an avalanche. So I didn't really get my counter-pack moment until after Afghanistan and until Iraq, when I just wasn't interested in swimming with the current. I just said, I'm going to go off in a tangent. And for that, I respect you, because it doesn't seem like it, but the people that shape your lives are the people who led, that cut trail, right? They went down the path that was overgrown, not behind the 5,000 people in buses. So I think people forget there's an impact with seeing somebody do something original and fresh, and then that shapes thousands of people's ideas and opinions. And you would be one of those guys who's like, I need to go do this. I want to go see that. And writing a book about going into dangerous places, you don't realize the impact that has by saying it's okay to do this. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, your book, I'm not blowing smoke, but your book definitely gave me sort of a confidence in a way. Think, okay, well, there is something. It was a thread of such that I could follow, and people do this stuff. It's one thing seeing the pictures of people, but the world's most dangerous places was, I think how many thousands or millions of people, I don't know how many you sold, but
I sold a lot. In the first year I sold over 120, 140,000, which blew my mind.
There was nothing else like it. It was and it was was the Bible in at that time. It was absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you, but at the same time, that was why I wrote it, right? It's like when you're a fireman, they go, run in that building, put out the fire, you're like, I'm not going in there. But if you train people to understand how to manage risk and what to do and what not to do, and put one foot in front of the other, and then show them that other people have gone before you, other people have done this, I think it empowers people, and that's a very hippie word, but I can't tell you how many emails I get from people saying, well, I was going to do this, but I read your book and I ended up doing that.
Yeah.
And that's the reason I live, is to say, hey, you remember the 18th century when people were sailing off to Borneo? Remember the 12th century when they sailed around Africa and they didn't even know what was around the corner? That's what humans are for. That's where you get your value out of life, not by buying seat number 12-3 on a 727 to Florida, right? That's not interesting.
Yeah, think about the type of stories you want to tell. Think that, the photography should, I think in many ways should be purpose driven. There's one thing going out and just making nice, pretty pictures, but, I think, use the work that it goes beyond just some sort of ego trip for you, producing it. I think that, I think it goes back to this idea of like concerned photography for me, that, the work needs to tell a story. It needs to open people's eyes. It needs to maybe not necessarily change people's minds, but at least sort of put another layer on the story or give a different perspective. And I think that's where, that's where the work. I've never chased the money on the work. I definitely need to make money, and it's been very, very challenging at times, for sure. But I think the best work I've ever done, it's never been about chasing the money. But what's interesting is, though, that often when we've done projects out of our own pocket, say, for example, the Source to Sea River Gambia expedition, or we did the first expedition we did was to walk the Gambia by foot. So it was like about 1,000-kilometer journey by foot. That work ended up going into museums. It ended up getting published in multiple places. I got awarded. So I think sometimes you've got to go. Don't even think about the end result with it. Really, you've just got to immerse yourself into actually creating the work, and then I think it will show us. I think it will reflect the honesty of the way you've gone into into tackle that project.